Chapter 19 of The Story of My Life and Work. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of My Life and Work by Booker T. Washington. The West Virginia and Other Receptions After European Trip. Early in August, we sailed for America from Southampton and had a very pleasant voyage on the magnificent ocean steamer St. Louis. On the voyage, I was called upon to speak again to the passengers and made many friends for our cause. While in Europe, I received the following invitation: Charleston, West Virginia, May 16, 1899. Professor B. T. Washington, Tuskegee Institute, Tuskegee, Alabama. Dear Sir, many of the best citizens of West Virginia have united in liberal expressions of admiration and praise of your worth and work, and desire that on your return from Europe you should favor them with your presence and with the inspiration of your words. We most sincerely endorse this move, and on behalf of the citizens of Charleston extend to you our most cordial invitation to have you come to us, that we may honor you who have done so much by your life and work to honor us. We are very truly yours, the Common Council of the City of Charleston, by W. Herman Smith, Mayor. This invitation from the City Council of Charleston was accompanied by the following: Professor B. T. Washington, Principal, Tuskegee Institute. Dear Sir, we, the citizens of Charleston and West Virginia, desire to express our pride in you and the splendid career you have thus far accomplished, and ask that we be permitted to show our pride and interest in a substantial way. Your recent visit to your old home in our midst awoke within us the keenest regret that we were not permitted to hear you and render some substantial aid to your work before you left for Europe. In view of the foregoing, we earnestly invite you to share the hospitality of our city upon your return from Europe, and give us the opportunity to hear you and put ourselves in touch with your work in a way that will be most gratifying to yourself, and that we may receive the inspiration of your words and presence. An early reply to this invitation, with an indication of the time you may reach our city, will greatly oblige. Yours very respectfully, the Charleston Daily Gazette, the Daily Mail Tribune, G. W. Atkinson, Governor, E. L. Boggs, Secretary to Governor, William M. O. Dawson, Secretary of State, L. M. La Follette, Auditor, J. R. Trotter, Superintendent of Schools, E. W. Wilson, ex-Governor, W. A. McCorkle, ex-Governor, John Q. Dickinson, President, Kanawha Valley Bank, L. Pritchard, President, Charleston National Bank, George S. Couch, President, Kanawha National Bank, Ed Reed, Cashier, Kanawha National Bank, George S. Laidley, Superintendent, City Schools, L. E. McWhorter, President, Board of Education, Charles K. Payne, Wholesale Merchant, C. C. Lewis, Jr., Wholesale Merchant, R. G. Hubbard, Wholesale Merchant, Daniel D. Brawley, City Sergeant, Grant P. Hall, Clerk of Circuit Court, O. A. Petty, Postmaster, R. Douglas Roller, Rector, St. John's Episcopal Church, M. M. Williamson, Cashier, Citizens National Bank, J. N. Carnes, Assistant Cashier, Citizens National Bank, J. A. Schwabe and Company, Merchants, J. A. de Gruyter, ex-mayor, A. H. Boyd, M.D., E. W. Staunton, Clerk, Kanawha County Court, M. F. Compton, Pastor, State Street M.E. Church, T. C. Johnson, Pastor, Charleston Baptist Church, Coyle and Richardson, Merchants, J. H. Gaines, United States District Attorney, Sterrett Brothers, Merchants, N.S. Burlew, merchant; Joel H. Ruffner, merchant; M.P. Ruffner, merchant; E.G. Pearson, senator; B.R. Winkler, member, City Council; Flournoy, Price and Smith, lawyers; Abney, Barnes and Company, wholesale merchants; Sam D. Littlepage, member of City Council; D.W. Shaw, pastor, Simpson M.E. Church; J. McHenry Jones, president, West Virginia Colored Institute; James M. Canty, J.C. Gilmer, Bird Prillerman, S.W. Starks, J.M. Hazelwood, Phil Waters, C.W. Hall, Judge Criminal Court; C.W. Boyd, Principal Garnet School; B.S. Morgan, member of City Council. This invitation to accept a reception from the citizens of Charleston, West Virginia, where I had spent my boyhood days, was a very satisfactory surprise. When I left Charleston, and when I left Malden, which is very near Charleston, I was quite a boy, and I had not been able to spend any great length of time there since I had first left to enter the Hampton Institute. I accepted the invitation for the Charleston reception, and when I reached Charleston was met by a committee of citizens headed by ex-Governor W.A. McCorkle. The meeting in connection with this reception was held in the Opera House and was presided over by Governor George W. Atkinson. It was very largely attended by white and colored citizens from that vicinity, a large number of whom had known me in my boyhood days. I must refrain from giving any detailed account of all the kind and complimentary things they were kind enough to say about me at this meeting. I spent several days in Charleston, visiting the scenes of my early boyhood and my sister in Malden, and many of the older citizens who remembered me. After this reception in Charleston, I was invited to go to Atlanta, Georgia, by the white and colored citizens to be given a reception there. The meeting in Atlanta was presided over by the governor of the state and was largely attended. Receptions by the citizens of Montgomery and New Orleans soon followed. Invitations to attend receptions in other states came to me, but I was not able to accept them all. In the fall of 1899, a meeting was held at Huntsville, Alabama, the spirit of which has since been taken up by other Southern cities, which promises to prove of lasting benefit in settling the race problem in the South. In October, a meeting was called at Huntsville, which had for its object the discussion of all matters relating to the upbuilding of the South. It was well attended by representatives from nearly every Southern state, and was a strong body of men. Among the other subjects discussed was the Negro problem in its relation to the industrial progress of the South. In connection with others, I was invited to deliver an address. The audience was composed mainly of Southern white men, but in it was a large number of Southern white women, together with quite an attendance of colored men and women. The address which I delivered on that occasion attracted a great deal of attention throughout the country, and for that reason I have taken the liberty of giving it in full. In all discussion and legislation bearing upon the presence of the Negro in America, it should be borne in mind that we are dealing with a people who were forced to come here without their consent, and in the face of a most earnest protest. This gives the Negro a claim upon your sympathy and generosity that no other race can possess. Besides, though forced from his native land into residence in a country that was not of his choosing, he has earned his right to the title of American citizen by obedience to the law, by patriotism and fidelity, and by the millions which his brawny arms and willing hands have added to the wealth of this country. In saying what I have today, although a Negro and an ex-slave myself, there is no white man whose heart is more wrapped up in every interest of the South, and who loves it more dearly than is true of myself. She can have no sorrow that I do not share. She can have no prosperity that I do not rejoice in. She can commit no error that I do not deplore. She can take no step forward that I do not approve. Different in race, in color, in history, we can teach the world that, although thus differing, it is possible for us to dwell side by side in love, in peace, and in material prosperity. We can be one, as I believe we will be in a larger degree in the future, in sympathy, purpose, forbearance, and mutual helpfulness. Let him who would embitter, who would bring strife between your race and mine, be accursed in his basket and in his store, accursed in the fruit of his body and the fruit of his land. No man can plan the degradation of another race without being himself degraded. The highest test of the civilization of any race is its willingness to extend a helping hand to the less fortunate. The South extends a protecting arm and a welcome voice to the foreigner of all nationalities, languages, and conditions. But in this, I pray that you will not forget the black man at your door, whose habits you know, whose fidelity you have tested. You may make of others larger gatherers of wealth, but you cannot make of them more law-abiding, useful, and God-fearing people than the Negro who has been by your side for 3 centuries, and whose toil in forest, field, and mine has helped to make the South the land of promise and glorious possibility. Before we can make much progress, we must decide whether or not the Negro is to be a permanent part of the South. With the light that is before us, I have no hesitation in declaring that the great bulk of the Negro population will reside among you. Any hesitation or doubting as to the permanent residence of the race will work infinite harm to the industrial and economic interests of both races. Here, in his wisdom, Providence has placed the Negro. Here he will remain. Here he came without a language. Here he found the Anglo-Saxon tongue. Here he came in paganism. Here he found the religion of Christ. Here he came in barbarism. Here he found civilization. Here he came with untrained hands. Here he found industry. If these centuries of contact with the American has done this, can you not trust to the wise Creator, aided by the efforts of the Negro himself and your guidance, to do the remainder? At this point, are you willing to cease your efforts and turn the work over to others for completion? Your duty to the Negro will not be fulfilled until you have made of him the highest type of American citizen in intelligence, usefulness, and morality. The South has within itself the forces that are to solve this tremendous problem. You have the climate, the soil, and the material wealth. You have the labor to be performed that will occupy many times our present Negro population. While the calls come daily from South Africa, from the Hawaiian Islands, from the North and the West for the strong and willing arm of the Negro in the field of industry, you, at your very door, have that which others are energetically seeking. Not only are you in possession of that which others are seeking, but, more important than all, custom and contact have so knit the two races together that the black man finds in these Southern states an open sesame in labor, industry, and business that is not surpassed anywhere. It is here alone, by reason of the presence of the Negro, that capital is free from tyranny and despotism that prevents you from employing whom you please, and for that wage that is mutually agreeable and profitable. It is here that that form of slavery which prevents a man from selling his labor to whom he pleases on account of his color is almost unknown. We have had slavery, now dead, that forced an individual to labor without a recompense, but none that compelled a man to remain in idleness while his family starved. The Negro, in all parts of the country, is beginning to appreciate the advantage which the South affords for earning a living, for commercial development, and in proportion as this is true, it will constitute the basis for the settlement of other difficulties. The colored man is beginning to learn that the bedrock upon which every individual rests his chances for success in life is securing in every manly way, never at the sacrifice of principle, the friendship, the confidence, the respect of his next-door neighbor in the little community in which he lives. Almost the whole problem of the Negro in the South rests itself upon the question as to whether he makes himself of such indispensable service to his neighbor, to the community, that no one can fill his place better in the body politic. There is no other safe course for the Negro to pursue. If the black man in the South has a friend in his white neighbor, and a still larger number of friends in his own community, he has a protection and a guarantee of his rights that will be more potent and more lasting than any federal Congress or any outside power can confer. While the Negro is grateful for the opportunities which he enjoys in the business of the South, you should remember that you are in debt to the black man for furnishing you with labor that is almost a stranger to strikes, lockouts, and labor wars. Labor that is law-abiding, peaceful, teachable, labor that is one with you in language, sympathy, religion, and patriotism. Labor that has never been tempted to follow the red flag of anarchy, but always the safe flag of his country and the spotless banner of the cross. But if the South is to go forward and not stand still, if she is to reach the highest reward from her wonderful resources and keep abreast of the progress of the world, she must reach that point without needless delay, where she will not be continually advertising to the world that she has a race question to settle. We must reach that point where, at every election, from the choice of a magistrate to that of a governor, the decision will not hinge upon a discussion or a revival of the race question. We must arrive at that period where the great fundamental question of good roads, education of farmers, agricultural and mineral development, manufacturing and industrial, and public school education will be, in a large degree, the absorbing topics in our political campaign. But that we may get this question from among us, the white man has a duty to perform, the black man has a duty. No question is ever permanently settled until it is settled in the principles of the highest justice. Capital and lawlessness will not dwell together. The white man who learns to disregard law when a Negro is concerned will soon disregard it when a white man is concerned. In the evolution of the South, it seems to me that we have reached that period where private philanthropy and the Christian church of the white South should, in a large degree, share directly in the elevation of the Negro. In saying this, I am not unmindful of or ungrateful for what has already been done by individuals and through public schools. When we consider the past, the wonder is that so much has been done by our brothers in white. All great reforms and improvements rest, in a large measure, upon the church for success. You acknowledge that Christianity and education make a man more valuable as a citizen, make him more industrious, make him earn more, make him more upright. In this respect, let me see how the three largest white denominations in the South regard the Negro. To elevate the ignorant and degraded in Africa, China, Japan, India, these three denominations in the South give annually about $544,000. But to elevate the ignorant, the degraded at your doors, to protect your families, to lessen your taxes, to increase their earning power, In a word, to Christianize and elevate the people at your very side, upon whom in a large measure your safety and property depend, these same denominations give $21,000. $21,000 for the benighted at your doors, $544,000 for the benighted abroad. That 35 years after slavery and a fratricidal war, the master should give even $21,000 through the medium of the church for the elevation of his former slave, means much. Nor would I have $1 less go to the foreign fields, but I would plead with all the earnestness of my soul that the Christian South give increased attention to the 8,000,000 of Negroes by whom it is surrounded. All this has a most vital and direct relation to the work of this industrial convention. Every dollar that goes into the education of the Negro is an interest-bearing dollar. For years, all acknowledge that the South has suffered from the low price of cotton because of overproduction. The economic history of the world teaches that an ignorant farming class means a single crop, and that a single crop means, too often, low prices from overproduction or famine from underproduction. The Negro constitutes the principal farming class of the South. So long as the Negro is ignorant in head, unskilled in hand, unacquainted with labor-saving machinery, so long will he confine himself to a single crop, and overproduction of cotton will result. So long as this is true, you will be bound in economic fetters. You will be hugging the bear while crying for someone to help you let go. Every man, black and white, in the South, with his crop mortgaged, in debt at the end of the year, buying his meat from Iowa, his corn from Illinois, his shoes from New York, his clothing from Pennsylvania, his wagon from Indiana, his plow from Massachusetts, his mule from Missouri, and his coffin from Ohio, everyone who is thus situated is a citizen who is not producing the highest results for his state. It is argued that the South is too poor to educate such an individual so as to make him an intelligent producer. I reply that the South is too poor not to educate such an individual. Ignorance is many-fold more costly to taxpayers than intelligence. Every black youth that is given this training of hand and strength of mind so that he is able to grasp the full meaning and responsibility of life, so that he can go into some forest and turn the raw material into wagons and buggies, becomes a citizen who is able to add to the wealth of the state and to bear his share of the expenses of educational government. Do you suggest that this cannot be done? I answer that it is being done every day at Tuskegee, and should be duplicated in 100 places in every Southern state. This I take to be the white man's burden just now. No, not his burden, but his privilege, his opportunity to give the black man sight, to give him strength, skill of hand, light of mind, and honesty of heart. Do this, my white friends, and I will paint you a picture that shall represent the future, partly as the outcome of this industrial convention, and will represent the land where your race and mine dwell. 14 slaves brought into the South a few centuries ago, in ignorance, superstition, and weakness, are now a free people, multiplied into 8,000,000. They are surrounded, protected, encouraged, educated in hand, heart, and head, given the full protection of the law, the highest justice meted out to them through courts and legislative enactment. They are stimulated and not oppressed, made citizens and not aliens, made to understand by word and act that in proportion as they show themselves worthy to bear responsibilities, the greater opportunities will be given them. I see them loving you, trusting you, adding to the wealth, the intelligence, the renown of each Southern commonwealth. In turn, I see you confiding in them, ennobling them, beckoning them on to the highest success. And we have all been made to appreciate in full that, quote, "the slave's chain and the master's alike are broken. The one curse of the race held both in tether. They are rising, all are rising, the black and white together." End quote. The most encouraging thing that happened in connection with this convention was an address delivered by ex-Governor McCorkle of West Virginia, in which he took the position that the time had come when the Southern states must face the race problem bravely and honestly, that the South could not any longer afford to get rid of the Negro's ballot by questionable methods, and that the Southern states ought to pass a law which would require an educational or property test, or both, for voting, and that this law ought to be made to apply alike to both races honestly and fairly, and that there should be no evasion permitted or attempted. Governor McCorkle is a Southern man, a Democrat. The words which he spoke on this occasion received the most hearty cheering, and the convention on the next day passed a resolution without a dissenting vote recommending Governor McCorkle's suggestion in the settlement of the franchise question in the Southern states. The influence of this convention was most beneficial on the minds of the Southern white people, and gave encouragement to the Negro and to his friends throughout the country. As I write this chapter, a conference is being arranged for by the leading white citizens of Montgomery, Alabama, which it is intended shall be there during May of each year. The object of this conference is to afford an opportunity for free and generous discussion of the race problem from every point of view. This movement, organized as it has been at the seat of the Confederate government, is most remarkable. It seems fitting that Montgomery should be the place where, from year to year, the best thought of the nation can assemble and assist in working out our national problem. In closing this chapter, I simply wish to add that I see no reason why the race should not feel encouraged. Every individual or race that has succeeded has done so only by paying the price which success demands. We cannot expect to get something for nothing. We shall continue to prosper in proportion as each individual proves his usefulness in the community, as each individual makes himself such a pillar in property and character that his community will feel that he cannot be spared. End of Chapter 19. Recording by Linda Johnson.
Chapter 20, Part 1 of The Story of My Life and Work. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Kennedy. The Story of My Life and Work by Booker T. Washington. Chapter 20, National Negro Business League, Part 1. After advising carefully with some of the most successful colored men throughout the country, it was deemed by us that there ought to be in the United States some organization that would bring together annually the most substantial and successful colored men and women who are engaged in business and industrial enterprises, for the purpose of consultation and receiving inspiration and encouragement from each other, as well as for the purpose of arranging for the organization of local business leagues that would cooperate with the national organization. Accordingly, the first meeting was called to meet in Boston in August 1900. The meeting was in session 3 days. The following is a copy of the call sent out for the meeting. After careful consideration and consultation with prominent colored people throughout the country, it has been decided to organize what will be known as the National Negro Business League. The need of an organization that will bring the colored people who are engaged in business together for consultation and to secure information and inspiration from each other has long been felt. Out of this national organization, it is expected will grow local business leagues that will tend to improve the Negro as a business factor. Boston has been selected as the place of meeting because of its historic importance, its cool summer climate, and general favorable condition. It is felt that the rest, recreation and new ideas which businessmen and women will secure from a trip to Boston will more than repay them for the time and money spent. The date of the meeting will be Thursday and Friday, August 23rd and 24th, because it is felt that this is the season when business can be left with least loss. Then, too, nearly all the steamship lines and railroads have reduced their rates to Boston to one fare for the round trip for the entire summer. Every individual engaged in business will be entitled to membership, but as far as possible, the colored people in all the cities and towns of the country should take steps at once to organize local business leagues where no such organizations already exist, and should see that these organizations send one or more delegates to represent them. It is very important that every line of business that any Negro man or woman is engaged in be represented. This meeting will present a great opportunity for us to show the world what progress we have made in business lines since our freedom. This organization is not in opposition to any other now in existence, but is expected to do a distinct work that no other organization now in existence can do as well. Another circular giving further information as to program and other details of the meeting will be issued in a few weeks. All persons, whether men or women, interested in the movement are invited to correspond with yours very truthfully, Booker T. Washington. Tuskegee, Alabama, June 15, 1900. The number and character of the men and women who responded to this call was a surprise and a source of gratification to everyone. Representatives came from 2/3 of the states in the Union, the greater proportion coming from the South. Many of them had been in slavery during a large portion of their lives and had started in a most humble way, and in most cases in poverty, and had struggled up through the greatest disadvantages to the point where they could be classed in the world of commerce. They represented many of the commercial enterprises in which white men are engaged. There were among them bankers, real estate dealers, grocers, dry goods merchants, caterers, manufacturers, contractors, druggists, undertakers, bakers, restaurant keepers, barbers, printers, plumbers, milliners, dressmakers, jewelers, publishers, and farmers. Perhaps the most gratifying feature in connection with the first session of the League was the entire absence of anything even bordering on bickering, greed for office, and point of order. In fact, during the whole meeting there was not a single point of order raised. The men and women composing the organization came together with an earnest purpose, that of doing something that would permanently benefit themselves and the race, and they would not permit anything to turn them aside from this purpose. While the League did not by any means underestimate the outrages inflicted upon the race, it was firmly of our opinion that one way to eventually end these outrages would be to help make the Negro such a potent factor in the commercial and industrial enterprises of the community in which he lives that he would demand respect and confidence by reason of his usefulness. It is not the object of the League to, in any way, place mere national success above the high religious character and thorough mental culture, but to make commercial success a means to the promotion of these ends. The choice of the officers of the League resulted in the following being elected: Booker T. Washington, President, Tuskegee, Alabama; Giles B. Jackson, Vice President, Richmond, Virginia; Mrs. Alberta Moore Smith, Vice President, Chicago, Illinois. Gilbert C. Harris, Treasurer, Boston, Massachusetts. Edward E. Cooper, Secretary, Washington, D.C. A. E. Johnson, Compiler, Raleigh, North Carolina. Executive Committee, T. Thomas Fortune, New York. Chairman, T. W. Jones, Chicago, Illinois. Isaiah T. Montgomery, Mound Bayou, Mississippi. Booker T. Washington, Tuskegee, Alabama. E. E. Cooper, Washington, D.C. George E. Jones, Little Rock, Arkansas. W. R. Pettiford, Birmingham, Alabama. Gilbert C. Harris, Boston, Massachusetts. Louis F. Baldwin, Boston, Massachusetts. Another very encouraging phase of the Boston meeting was the surprising number of highly successful men and women who appeared from different parts of the country and who before had not been heard from. Many expressed the idea that the Business League had been long wanted and had in its power to do a work which no other organization could perform. The following editorials from various influential newspapers will give some of the value that was placed upon the Business League meeting. From the Outlook, New York City. The convention of the National Negro Business League held in Boston last week brought together upwards of 100 delegates, representing over 20 different states. The members of the convention made an excellent impression upon the representatives of the Boston press, both by their appearance and the intellectual quality of their speeches. The League was organized upon the initiative of Booker T. Washington, and his common-sense philosophy permeated most of the addresses. Had these been made at a gathering of white leaders, they might justly be condemned as materialistic. Indeed, one of them glorifying the almighty dollar as the new king that has been born should be so condemned. But in the main, the emphasis put upon the acquiring of property sprang from the desire to lift up the manhood of the Negro race. 4. There is a moral difference between the advocacy of money-getting to secure independence and advocacy of money-getting to secure power. Economic independence is today as much needed for the further advancement of the Negro race as was emancipation from slavery for the advance which the present generation has witnessed. Even so, uncompromising an opponent of materialism as Mr. William Lloyd Garrison, Jr. recognized this and emphasized it in his address to the convention. "The particular word I wish to leave with you," he said, "is this: aim to be your own employers as speedily as possible. If you are farmers, do not rest until you control the land from which you gain your living. If you are mechanics or traders, seek first to gain a home without a mortgage, foregoing many desirable things until you are free from debt. Independence and debt cannot long keep company. But in the South, as in the North, possession of honestly earned property will surely bring respect and increase personal security." Among the Negro speakers were several men who have been remarkably successful. Among others, a slave of Jefferson Davis, who is now mayor of his little town in Mississippi. The speeches of some of these men telling of early struggles were full of encouragement to Negroes everywhere. The fact that some Negroes have succeeded in business, as well as the fact that some have succeeded in literature and art, forces all men to distinguish between Negroes and Negroes, and open the door of opportunity to all Negroes who aspire. From Buffalo Express. The recent meeting of the National Negro Business League in Boston brought to public notice a new line of endeavor advocated by the leading Negroes of the country for the betterment of their race's commercial and social position. The call for the formation of the League was issued by President Booker T. Washington of the Tuskegee Institute, and that it was heartily responded to by Negro businessmen in all parts of the country was shown by the assembling of delegates from no less than 25 states. The key to the discussion during this interesting conference is to be found in the address of Professor Booker T. Washington, who said in part, "I have faith in the timeliness of this organization. As I have noted the conditions of our people in nearly every part of our country, I have always been encouraged by the fact that almost without exception, whether in the North or South, wherever I have seen a black man who was succeeding in business, who was a taxpayer, and who possessed intelligence and high character, that individual was treated with highest respect by the members of the white race. In proportion as we can multiply those examples north and south, will our problem be solved. Let every man strive to become the most useful and indispensable man in his community. A useless, idle class is a menace and a danger. We must not in any part of our country become discouraged, notwithstanding the way often seems dark and desolate. We must maintain faith in ourselves and in our country. This opens the line of work, the possibilities of which are most promising. The development of industrial life among the Negroes in the South by schools is essential to the growth of one element and is remedying the evil of idleness. The new plan goes farther and aids in developing the business instincts of the race, establishing Negroes in mercantile pursuits and in other ways making them important factors in the commercial circles of the country. Already there are many examples of the progress of the Negro in this direction. In Chicago is a large cooperative store where groceries and meats are sold, while Philadelphia and Richmond each have a large department store conducted by Negroes. Nearly 200 Negroes in Chicago alone are engaged in various lines of business. Still another example is found in the Corporation of New Jersey, of an investment and supply company in which the corporators are Negroes. This company is authorized to furnish supplies to families, establish stores, deal in real estate without limit, and engage generally in commercial pursuits. It is stated in the papers that the company will carry on a portion of its business in the cities of New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, Chicago, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Wilmington, Delaware, and Richmond and Norfolk, Virginia, as well as in other places. The capitalization of this company is $75,000. From Springfield Republican. The organization of the National Negro Business League by the Great Convention at Boston last week was one of the most important steps yet taken in the lifting of the Negro race to that equality proclaimed implicitly by the Declaration of Independence and explicitly by the constitutional amendments which followed the war. Between 100 and 200 delegates were present. The South, that made the Civil War for Negro slavery, was well represented. New England, New York, Pennsylvania were now the ruling factors in this Congress of Men, opening a new stage in the progress of the race. They came as Americans, and who has a better right than the Negro to that title? A few days ago, a Southern white said that the Negroes had no country, no birthright, not reflecting that he has been given a country by arbitrament of war, and that his birthright, in a majority of cases, was quite as clearly traceable to white ancestry as his traducer's own. But the Negro race has been compelled to a solidarity which is rare in mixed races. The man or woman so white that no one could guess from his hair or complexion the stain of black blood, perforce casts in his lot with the blackest Afro-American, and be it acknowledged that he does it proudly, for the warmest advocates of the Negro race feeling are these very persons. They rightly feel that the African descent is the more honorable. The convention was one of such dignity and such seriousness, such clear-headed consideration of the situation, views being taken in broader horizon than those of the nigger haters, as to win respect on all sides. And it will not be strange, indeed, it is to be expected that the effect all over the country will be of the most valuable sort. It is scarcely possible to underrate or condemn a class of people who have so evinced their equality in what the white man especially prides himself on, the faculty of concentrated effort, the power of organization. This has been attained by the Negro under the most adverse conditions. As we know, even when he has been favored, he has been scantily helped. He has helped himself, and his small advantages he has made the most of, proving that he has self-same spirit and purpose that has made America, and is just as much an American and as entitled to the blessings and honors of life as a descendant of the English Puritan or the French Huguenots, the Hollanders, the Irish, the Scandinavian, and the German. And when we reflect upon the motley crowd from Southern Europe that have entered our country of late years, the comparison becomes absurd. The most interesting address was that of A.I. Hillier, a graduate of the University of Minnesota, a prominent citizen of the national capital, who has compiled and published 3 editions of a directory of the colored businessmen and women in Washington, and founded and was first president of the Union League, so described. Mr. Hillier was appointed by the United States Commission to make up the figures of the Negro exhibit at the Paris Exposition, and thus he spoke with knowledge. By the census of 1890, it appears that 25 years after emancipation, the race had a representative in every business listed in the census schedules. The numbers engaged and the capital invested in many branches were not imposing, but the beginning had been made. The census showed 20,020 persons of Negro descent in business. There were agents and collectors, auctioneers, bankers and brokers, 114, druggists, dairymen, dry goods dealers, grocers, hotel keepers, liquor dealers, undertakers, officials of banks and insurance companies, journalists and publishers, builders and contractors, photographers, marketmen, printers, blacksmiths, watch and clockmakers, and, of course, barbers. Outside of the business list, over 20,000 are to be numbered. Over 1,700 barbers. Next to these in numbers, caterers, hotel and restaurant men. Mr. Hillier noted a stove foundry in Tennessee, a cotton mill in North Carolina, a carriage factory in Ohio, and several brick-making plants with large capital. He mentioned 4 banks, one in Birmingham, Alabama, one in Washington, D.C., and one in Richmond, Virginia. Nor is it true that the business patronage of these and other institutions is confined to the Negro. Giles B. Jackson of Richmond, who spoke concerning the Negroes as real estate owners in that region, said that when the city of Richmond was unable, because of its poverty, to keep its white schools open, it applied to all of the white banks for money in vain. Then an appeal was made to the colored bank. "How much do you want?" was asked. The reply was $50,000. "You can have 100,000, said the cashier, and this was the sum loaned. Mr. Jackson also said that 1/20th of the real estate in Virginia is owned by the colored people. The doings of the convention have been fair, measured by the dispatches we have published. They show an undaunted spirit in the face of all discouragements and a ready hopefulness in their achievements. It was a great project to form this league, and its principal pusher, if not its originator, was Mr. Washington of Tuskegee, the great statesman of the Negro race, and not the less great because he is working without the help of the state and directly for his people. Not, however, solely for them, for Mr. Washington knows, as all thoughtful men ought to see, that the white races are on their trial in this matter. They have to determine whether barbarism or civilization shall rule. Much for the future of the United States depends upon the wise counsel of Booker T. Washington, who is elevating his race and also elevating the human family itself. He is fitly chosen the first president of the National Negro Business League. End of Chapter 20, Part 1. Chapter 20, Part 2 of the Story of My Life and Work. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Kennedy. The Story of My Life and Work by Booker T. Washington. Chapter 20, National Negro Business League, Part 2. One of the most interesting articles about the first session of the League was contributed by Mr. Henry J. Barrymore to the Boston Transcript. It seems quite fairly the conclusion reached by most persons who attended the session of the League. New Orleans, New York, and Akron on the one hand, the Negro Business Convention on the other. It is a roundabout logic, but nevertheless a good one, that answers race antipathy with commercial success. Mr. J. H. Lewis got close to the root of things when he told that convention that the Negro problem was at bottom a mercantile problem, that the business world knows nothing of color, that human selfishness, the desire of every man to get money, would eventually banish prejudice. The almighty dollar is thoroughly colorblind. Money commands respect. Rare is the merchant or manufacturer who will refuse to shake hands with $100,000. But what hope has the Negro to succeed in business? Said Mr. Lewis. If you can make a better article than anybody else and sell it cheaper than anybody else, you can command the markets of the world. Produce something that somebody else wants, whether it be a shoestring or a savings bank, and the purchaser or patron will not trouble himself to ask who the seller is. The same great economic law runs through every line of industry, whether it be farming, manufacturing, mercantile, or professional pursuits. Recognize this fundamental law of trade, add to it tact, good manners, a resolute will, a tireless capacity for work, and you will succeed in business. I have found in my own experience of 30 years in business that success and its conditions lie all around us, regardless of race or color. I believe that it is possible for any man with the proper stuff in him to make a success in business wherever he may be. The best and only capital necessary to begin with is simply honesty, industry, and common sense. This is good reasoning. It is also both practical and practicable. Results prove it. Mr. Booker T. Washington, in his travel through widely separated regions of the United States, found so many Negroes engaged in profitable commercial pursuits that he thought the time had come to put the Negro businessman on terms of mutual acquaintanceship and mutual helpfulness. Then, with that rare insight which characterizes the man's really indisputable genius, he conceived a big convention where the Negro business world should take to itself a voice that must at once impress the white man and encourage the black man. The plan worked as per specification. Newspapers saw space in it, space and timeliness and vital human interest, with here and there a touch of the sensational. The business Negro is, therefore, getting the public notice he so genuinely deserves. It will do us all good. For one, it did me good. I confess I went to the Parker Memorial with ill-stifled chuckles of expectant amusement. My chuckles ceased as I entered, for there was something impressive in the splendid show of bunting, something impressive too in the gravity of the colored audience, and something wonderfully earnest about the big banner at the back of the stage. That banner made plain, blunt use of the word Negro. So did the speakers. Racial pride is beginning to assert itself. These men have little to say of the colored people or of the Afro-American. They are outgrowing all that sort of affectation. They do, however, insist that the word Negro shall be written with a capital N. And why should they not? We capitalize the Indian, the Chinaman, the Filipino. Shame to withhold so small an honor from the Negro. Another confession. I looked for the tall silk hat and the flashy suit of clothes. They were there, but not among the delegates. The silly, uneducated, shiftless Negro put his pay on his back. The business Negro put his pay in the bank. Here were men who had penetrated the real secret of success, men who understood that the only sure basis of progress is economic, men who would sacrifice today's indulgence for tomorrow's independence, men who cared so much for social and educational advancement that they had come to despise the puerile strut and brag of the Negro dandy. Their faces surprise me as much as their clothes. There is a certain contemptible type of Caucasian who affects an equally contemptible inability to tell one Negro from another. At the Negro convention, he would have had no excuse for such downright stupidity. No white audience ever showed a more interesting variety of feature and countenance, and yet for all that, I thought I could class those men by types. The cakewalk Negro, the old Confederate colonel Negro, and the well-to-do merchant Negro. The cakewalk Negro, round-faced, shavy-headed, black as a coal scuttle, clad in rainbow-tinted cheap finery, came from Pleasant Street. No seat on the platform for him. The old Confederate Colonel Negro, gray mustache and imperial, gold-bowed spectacles and somber dress, this was the man from the South. The well-to-do merchant Negro hailed from nowhere in particular, and save for his color, was in no striking respect very different from white men of a similar rank in the world of trade. Sometimes the color was puzzling. A gentleman from Dixie was as white as I am. A handsome fellow he was, with a firm, stocky figure and beautifully chiseled features. Readers of Mr. Charles W. Chestnut's current series in the Transcript would view that colored Southerner with a keen ethnological interest. Which reminds me, a year or so ago I took lunch in Cleveland with Mr. Chestnut himself. That was before his books had called worldwide attention to his color. I had read his stories in the Atlantic and said, "Tell me, Mr. Chestnut, how did you ever come to know the Northern darky so well?" Mr. Chestnut replied that he had rather unusual opportunities for observing the Northern darky at close range. 6 months later, I learned I had had the pleasure of lunching with a cultured Negro, and that Mr. Chestnut had been bubbling with merriment ever since. I did not suspect it at the time. The business convention abounded with just such unrecognizable Negroes. Under the yellow glare of the evening lights, it was difficult, in many cases, to tell who was white and who was colored. In fact, I began to wonder whether I was white myself. The ear was as often deceived as the eye. Had I been blind, I would have said the speakers were white Southerners. With hardly any exception, their grammar was perfect and their pronunciation excellent. I had expected some marvelous Negro malapropism. I heard none. I came with the writer's usual hunger for color, but nothing could have been more hopelessly devoid of color than the colored Congress. Those black men had, even to a considerable degree, the common Caucasian foibles. Uniformly, when told they had only 5 minutes left, they consumed 4 minutes at least in explaining how sorry they were that there remained but 5 minutes. Uniformly, they wasted precious time in introducing their speeches with irrelevant stories. Uniformly, they put themselves at altogether unnecessary pains to explain that Boston was the grandest city in North America, or anywhere else. It pleased me to see how brave the Negro could be and how patient. I waited for outbreaks of protest against white oppression, and especially against recent white cruelty. I heard none. No one cried baby. The spirit of the whole occasion was distinctly hopeful. Regarding material advancement as the basis of every other sort of progress, the convention listened eagerly to every account of Negroes, once poor, who had built houses, bought land, opened places of independent business, and established solid bank accounts. Repeatedly it was pointed out that men born slaves had actually become rich. Also that the total material progress of the Negro race had been accomplished in only 35 years. A happy augury for the future. Such utterances called out tumultuous cheers, mingled with the shrill rebel yell of the Southerners. Yet there was scarcely any tendency to indulge in racial self-laudation. More than once the speakers insisted that the commercial superiority of the white man must be frankly recognized and that the Negro must learn to copy the white man's methods. In general, the convention depreciated the Negro's desire to flatter the Negro. Far from that, let us look the conditions honestly and courageously in the face. Let us say the things that will help our people, whether those things are pleasant or otherwise. To be sure, a good many of those beneficial deliverances were sheer platitudes, but the Negro race is in need of platitudes. It is fortunately developing a relish for platitudes. It has reached that stage of moral and intellectual evolution where it has come to realize the vital importance of plain, homespun, brown-colored truths. It is laying the basis for its social philosophy by making sure of its axioms. Supposedly an enormous fund of emotional dynamics was walled in and roofed over at the Negro Convention. Nevertheless, the convention left the impression of a deliberative council seriously at work. Somebody says the best test of the earnestness and intelligence of an audience is to see how the audience acts when a little interruption occurs. The convention was put to that test. In the midst of Mr. William Lloyd Garrison's stirring address, the fire company, stationed just across the way, responded to an alarm. There was pandemonium in the street below, but not an eye left the speaker. Just once the convention lost complete control of itself. A tall, slender youth had spoken some moments in a vein so modest that the chairman interrupted. "Gentlemen," said he, The speaker hasn't much to say for himself, so I'm going to put in a word of my own. I can't help it. That man, gentlemen, that man there was in the front of the charge at San Juan. At that, the ear seemed suddenly to be composed of equally active parts of handkerchiefs, hats, and hilarious chairs. The slender youth bowed acknowledgments and said his speech ought to take a military turn, but that he hesitated to say the thing he had in mind. It was not a pleasant thing. "Say it out," yelled 20 voices. So he said it out. He was disappointed in Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt, said he, had slandered the Negro soldier, and there was really no braver soldier in the world. The Negro never flinched, never retreated. Why, gentlemen, way back in the old days, there was a Negro in the fight. And as for what Colonel Roosevelt says about Negro soldiers being dependent upon white officers, I'll tell you the truth. There wasn't any officer in control on San Juan Hill, or rather, every Negro private was a Negro captain. Then I knew what Stephen Crane meant by red yells. But this, as I say, was an isolated instance of rampant emotionalism. The uproar was not repeated. And think what the orderly, decorous, well-dressed, educated assemblage represents. Think of the change brought by 35 years of Negro progress. Slaves, freedmen, laborers, capitalists, reformers, leaders of a struggling race, and all in scarcely more than a generation of time. Think of the millions who are still coming up, the millions who have in them the possibilities of success, the millions whom we must judge by the standards of the business convention, and not by the standards of the criminal courts. The convention, now that it has come and gone, leaves a memory of heroic hopefulness and patience, not unmingled with pathos. It was significant and altogether appropriate that a Negro singer on Thursday evening should have sung the recessional with its double refrain, "Lord God of hosts, be with us yet." After considering the matter carefully, it was decided to make the League a permanent organization that should meet annually. The second session was held in Chicago, Illinois, August 21st, 22nd, and 23rd, 1901, and was even more largely attended than was the first meeting. This meeting was made noteworthy in one respect by the result of the following telegram of congratulation from the late President of the United States. Canton, Ohio, August 22nd, 1901. President Booker T. Washington. Convention of the National Negro Business League. I have received your recent letter, but regret that I will be unable to accept your kind invitation to attend the meeting of the National Negro Business League, to be held in Chicago this week. Please accept for yourself and those assembled my best wishes for the advancement and prosperity of your race. William McKinley. The second meeting was free, as was the first one, from those unseemly and useless parliamentary wrangles which too often mar the character of public meetings among our people. The second meeting was composed, as was the first, of hard-headed, earnest men and women who met for a purpose and were determined that success should crown their efforts. The following program will give some idea of the scope and character of the Chicago meeting. Wednesday, August 21st, 10 a.m. Meeting called to order. Invocation. Address of welcome on behalf of the state, His Excellency Governor Richard Yates. Address of welcome on behalf of the City of Chicago, His Honorable Mayor Carter H. Harrison. Address of welcome on behalf of the colored businessmen and women of Chicago, Mr. W. F. Taylor. The President's Address. Appointment of committees. A. Credentials. B. Resolutions and organization. The Business League of Virginia. Giles B. Jackson, Richmond, Virginia. Business features of the Order of True Reformers. W. L. Taylor, Richmond, Virginia. What the Twin City Business Association is accomplishing. J. A. Wilson, Kansas City, Missouri. Can the Negro succeed as a businessman? Theodore W. Jones, Chicago, Illinois. Evening session, 8 p.m. The Negro Women's Business Club of Chicago and its achievements. Mrs. Alberta M. Smith, Chicago, Illinois. Merchandising. Charles Banks, Clarksdale, Mississippi. The Grocery Business. William Oscar Murphy, Atlanta, Georgia. The Hampton Building and Loan Association. Harris Barrett, Hampton, Virginia. Negro Business Enterprises of Mobile. A. N. Johnson, Mobile, Alabama. Thursday, August 22nd, 10 a.m. The Drug Business. Dr. Willis S. Sturz, Decatur, Alabama. Mistakes to be avoided. S. R. Scottron, Brooklyn, New York. Merchant Tailoring. L. G. Wheeler, Chicago, Illinois. Colored Businesswomen of the East. Mrs. Dora A. Miller, Brooklyn, New York. The Game and Poultry Business. Walter P. Hall, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Dressmaking and Millinery. Mrs. Emma L. Pitts, Macon, Georgia. Representing the Kansas City Coal and Feed Company and the Wyandotte Drug Company, I. F. Bradley, Kansas City, Kansas. No night session. A banquet was tendered the officers and delegates of the National Negro Business League by the citizens of Chicago, Thursday evening, August 22nd, at 1st Regiment Armory, 16th and Michigan Boulevard. Friday, August 23rd, 10 a.m. Carriage Manufacturing. F. D. Patterson, Greenfield, Ohio. Real Estate. J. C. Napier, Nashville, Tennessee. The Negro in Insurance. W. F. Graham, Richmond, Virginia. The Negro as a Silk Operative. T. W. Thurston, Fayetteville, North Carolina. The Negro Publishing House. R. H. Boyd, Nashville, Tennessee. Catering. C. H. Smiley, Chicago, Illinois. J. No. S. Trower, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Report of Officers. Report of Committee. A. Resolutions. B. Organization. Evening session, 8 p.m. The Negro as a Manufacturer and Jobber. Anthony Overton, Kansas City, Kansas. The Logic of Business Development. T. Thomas Fortune, New York, New York. The Founding of a Negro City. S. L. Davis, Hobson City, Alabama. Isaiah T. Montgomery, Mound Bayou, Mississippi. The reception tendered the members of the League by the citizens of Chicago at Armory Hall brought 2,500 of the most intelligent and cultured colored people that it has ever been my privilege to meet in any part of the country. I am sure that no one could have come in contact with those attending the reception and have sat for 3 days' session of the League without being convinced that the race has made tremendous progress since the days of slavery. The present officers of the National Negro Business League elected at Chicago, August 23rd, are as follows. President, Booker T. Washington, Tuskegee, Alabama. First Vice President, Giles B. Jackson, Richmond, Virginia. Second Vice President, Mrs. D. R. Robinson, St. Louis, Missouri. Third Vice President, Charles Banks, Clarksdale, Mississippi. Recording Secretary, Edward E. Cooper. Corresponding Secretary, Emmett J. Scott, Tuskegee, Alabama. Treasurer, Gilbert C. Harris, Boston, Massachusetts. Compiler, S. Lang Williams, Chicago, Illinois. Registrar P.J. Smith, Jr., Boston, Massachusetts. Executive Committee T. Thomas Fortune, Chairman. New York, Dr. S.B. Courtney, Boston, Massachusetts. T.W. Jones, Chicago. George E. Jones, Little Rock, Arkansas. N.T. Velver, Brighton, Pennsylvania. W.L. Taylor, Richmond, Virginia. T.A. Brown, San Francisco, California. J.C. Napier, Nashville, Tennessee. N.M. Louis, Pensacola, Florida. End of Chapter 20, Part 2. Chapter 21 of the Story of My Life and Work. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Kennedy. The Story of My Life and Work by Booker T. Washington. Chapter 21. The Movement for a Permanent Endowment. Having, through nearly 20 years of incessant toil, succeeded in securing for Tuskegee the annual expenses for running the school and the money with which to purchase its present plant and equipment, valued at about $300,000, it has been for several years clearly seen by the trustees and myself that the thing needed to secure Tuskegee in the future was a permanent endowment fund. Not only is an endowment fund necessary as an assurance that the work of Tuskegee shall go on in the future, but it is necessary in order to relieve the principal of the hard work of remaining in the North the greater portion of his time begging and speaking in order to raise the amount annually necessary to carry on the work. An endowment fund, the interest from which would be sufficient to meet partially the current expenses of the institution, would enable the principal to devote his time to the executive work of the school, and this would obviously lead to greater perfection in the work there, both in the academic and industrial branches. Improved methods and facilities would redound to the benefit of each person educated at the institution. Various appeals for the last year or two have been made to the Friends of Tuskegee for an endowment fund, and within the past year we have received by gifts and bequests $38,848.93 for this purpose. The United States Congress, in the winter of 1899, donated to Tuskegee 25,000 acres of land out of the public domain of Alabama, the proceeds of this grant to be added to the endowment fund. No organized effort, however, was made to interest the Friends of Tuskegee in the matter of raising a permanent endowment fund until the fall of 1899. It was then thought by the trustees and myself that the time was ripe for putting forth specific effort in this direction. Accordingly, it was decided to hold a public meeting in December 1899 in the city of New York, at which the work of Tuskegee might be set forth by capable speakers, and the good the school was accomplishing not only among the Negroes of the Black Belt, but for the whole country, might be brought forcibly to the ears of the public. This meeting was held in the concert hall of Madison Square Garden in the city of New York on the evening of December 4, 1899. I take pleasure in giving a description of this meeting and in mentioning some of its immediate results, because it proved to be a magnificent tribute to the cause for which Tuskegee stands. Ex-President Grover Cleveland had very kindly consented to be present and to preside at this meeting. The beautiful concert hall, which holds about 2,000 people, was packed that night so that it was difficult to procure even standing room. Many prominent people occupied seats upon the platform and in the boxes. Among the former I might mention Mr. Morris K. Jessup, Mr. W.M.E. Dodge, Mr. Alexander Orr, Mr. Robert C. Ogden, Mr. George Foster Peabody, Reverend Dr. C.H. Parkhurst, Reverend Dr. D.H. Greer, Mr. Charles E. Bigelow, Mr. Arthur Curtis James, Mr. John A. Stewart, Mr. A.S. Frizzle, Mr. George McKenney, Mr. Horace White, Honorable John M. Barrett, Mr. Walter H. Page, Honorable Seth Lowe, Honorable E. M. Shepard, Honorable Levi P. Morton, Dr. N. M. Butler, Mr. J. G. Phelps Stokes, Mr. John E. Parsons, Honorable Carl Schurz, Reverend P. B. Tompkins, Mr. Samuel P. Avery, Mr. R. F. Cutting, Mr. J. S. Kennedy, Mr. C. P. Huntington, Mr. C. S. Smith, Mr. R. W. Gilder, Chancellor H. K. McCracken, Mr. William G. Lowe, Mr. W. P. Ware, Professor Chas. Sprague Smith, Mr. W. M. J. Schiefelin, Mr. Charles Lanier, Mr. J. Hampton Robb, Mr. Dorman B. Eaton, Mr. Horace E. Deming, Mr. Joseph LaRoque, Mr. J. Kennedy Todd, Mr. LeGrand B. Cannon, Mr. Charles S. Fairchild, Mr. August Belmont, Mr. Jacob H. Schiff, Mr. Gustav Schwab, Mr. James C. Carter, Mr. John L. Cadwallader, Mr. Cleveland H. Dodge, Reverend Dr. H. Heber Newton, Mr. Edward Hewitt, Dr. Hamilton W. Mobby, Mr. Wheeler H. Peckham, Mr. Everett P. Wheeler, Mr. I. Frederick Kernoshan, Colonel W. M. J., Mr. Chas. C. Beeman, Reverend Dr. W. M. R. Huntington, Reverend Dr. Morgan Dix, Reverend Dr. Lyman Abbott, Mr. William Dean Howells, General Wigger Swan, Honorable W. L. Strong, Mr. Charles H. Marshall, Mr. Henry Holt, Mr. J. Pierpont Morgan. Among those who occupied boxes were Mr. Robert C. Ogden, Mr. and Mrs. W. E. Dodge, Mrs. C. R. Lowell, Mr. Henry Villard, Mr. C. D. Smith, Miss Putman, Mr. George Foster Peabody, Mr. and Mrs. John D. Rockefeller, Mrs. Frederick Billings, Miss Olivia Stokes, Mrs. C. Hay Runkle, Miss Matilda W. Bruce, Miss Mary Parsons, Mr. W. H. Baldwin, Jr., Mr. and Mrs. Morris K. Jessup, Mr. and Mrs. Theodore K. Gibbs, Mrs. W. H. Harkness, Mrs. C. B. Hackley, Miss Bryce, Mrs. F. C. Barlow, Mr. and Mrs. A. T. White, Mr. and Mrs. C. M. Pratt, Mr. C. E. Bigelow. The day before the meeting was to be held, Mr. Cleveland found himself confined to his house by illness, and wrote me of his inability to be present. The letter proved to be almost, if not quite, as great an encouragement to the object of the meeting as Mr. Cleveland's presence would have been. The letter was read at the meeting, and I think the reader will not complain if I quote it here. It is as follows. Princeton, New Jersey, December 3, 1899. My dear Mr. Washington, my inability to attend the meeting tomorrow evening in the interest of Tuskegee Institute is a very great disappointment to me. If my participation could have in the slightest degree aided the cause you represent, or in the least encouraged you in your noble efforts, I would have felt that my highest duty was in close company with my greatest personal gratification. It has frequently occurred to me that in the present condition of our free Negro population in the South, and the incidents often surrounding them, we cannot absolutely calculate that the future of our nation will always be free from dangers and convulsions, perhaps not less lamentable than those which resulted from the enslaved Negroes less than 40 years ago. Then the cause of trouble was the injustice of the enslavement of 4 millions, but now we have to deal with 8 millions, who, though free and invested with all the rights of citizenship, still constitute in the body politic a mass largely affected with ignorance, slothfulness, and a resultant lack of appreciation of the obligations of that citizenship. I am so certain that these conditions cannot be neglected, and so convinced that the mission marked out by the Tuskegee Institute presents the best hope of their amelioration, and that every consideration makes immediate action important, whether based upon Christian benevolence, a love of country, or selfish material interests, that I am profoundly impressed with the necessity of such prompt aid to your efforts as will best ensure their success. I cannot believe that your appeal to the good people of our country will be unsuccessful. Such disinterested devotion as you have exhibited, and the results already accomplished by your unselfish work, ought to be sufficient guarantee of the far-reaching and beneficent results that must follow such a manifestation of Christian charity and good citizenship as would be apparent in a cordial and effective support of your endeavor. I need not say how grateful I am to be able to indicate to you that such support is forthcoming. It will be seen by the letters which I enclose that already an offer has been made through me by a benevolent lady in a western city to contribute $25,000 toward the Endowment Fund, upon condition that other subscriptions to this fund aggregate the amount required. With so good a beginning, I cannot believe it possible that there will be a failure in securing the endowment which Tuskegee so much needs. Yours very truly, Grover Cleveland. Booker T. Washington, Esquire. In the absence of Mr. Cleveland, the Honorable Carl Schurz consented to preside at the meeting, and, as might be expected of one so ripe in experiences, he proved to be all that could be desired of a presiding officer. His short speech on taking the chair showed a hearty sympathy with the work that is being done at Hampton and Tuskegee. Mr. Schurz is a well-known German-American who has been a general in the War of the Rebellion, a senator in Congress, and a member of the cabinet of President Hayes. He has been for years a foremost worker in the civil service reform movement. He is a writer of ability and a man who needs no introduction in the United States. The Tuskegee Male Quartet was present and rendered plantation melodies to the great delight of the audience. The first speaker of the evening was Mr. Walter H. Page, a native of North Carolina, but for several years the editor of the Atlantic Monthly in Boston. The effort of Mr. Page was truly wonderful. He is a native Southerner who has studied the Negro question for more than 20 years from every point of view, as he alleged. He was well prepared to speak, and with irresistible logic and unusual eloquence pointed out the benefits of the Tuskegee plan for the solution of the race problem. He claimed it to be the only solution that had been discovered. He pointed out how hopeless was the condition of the race unless the problem was solved by industrial and moral training, and how hopeful would be its condition if the problem were settled in this way. At the conclusion of Mr. Page's address, Mr. William H. Baldwin, Jr., one of our trustees, and a member of the Committee on the Investment of the Endowment Fund, spoke in behalf of the trustees as follows. It is my privilege to speak to you as a trustee of Tuskegee Institute on the subject of its finances. The generous friends who have made Tuskegee possible should know its exact business condition. It has been a hard but beneficial struggle for Mr. Washington to raise the funds necessary to pay the current expenses of the institution, to acquire the 2,267 acres of land, and to erect the 42 buildings now comprising the school. During the 18 years of development, there have been imperative demands from time to time for buildings for which no specific funds were available. The rapid growth of the work, the constantly increasing number of students, with applications for admission far beyond the capacity of the buildings, put a burden on the trustees which compelled them, in their positions as trustees, to advance some of the unrestricted contributions for the construction of buildings to protect the general welfare of the institution. During this period, enough money has been collected to pay the current expenses and to accumulate $300,000 in plant and equipment and an endowment fund of $62,253.39. No mortgage has ever been placed upon the property, and the trustees desire to pay any and all indebtedness without mortgaging the property, and without using other resources which should be used for endowment or for increased plant. The grant of 25,000 acres of land from the United States government in 1897 is valued at a minimum of $100,000, and that land, together with unrestricted legacies to be received, are obviously full security for the advances made by the trustees. But these resources should be kept for permanent uses and to care for the constantly increasing demands of the school. The income for the fiscal year ending May 31, 1899 amounted to $110,161.59. The current expenses for running the institution were $64,386.70, showing very economical administration for the care of nearly 1,200 people. The balance of income was used in the construction and completion of buildings and in reducing a part of the indebtedness. The endowment fund received $38,848.93 last year. In order that the accounts of the school should be kept on a strictly business basis, the trustees in 1897 appointed an auditor, a certified public accountant of New York, to direct and supervise all the accounts. The trustees are in position to assure you that any contributions made are properly and rigidly accounted for, and furthermore, that all expenditures are made with great economy and wise discretion. In short, Tuskegee has a good business organization and warrants the entire confidence of its friends. Its endowment fund will be strictly preserved. Special contributions for buildings or other specific purposes will be kept separate from their particular uses, and the contributions for current expenses will be expended economically and effectively. Though the school is still in need of simple buildings for dormitories, classrooms, and shops, the trustees determined in 1898 that a point of development had been reached when the Institute should not go into debt for any new buildings, and that in future no buildings should be erected until all the necessary funds are guaranteed for the purpose. There are two interests to be served by the upbuilding and strengthening of Tuskegee: the whole Negro race and the country as a whole. The industrial education of the Negro, the education from the foundation up, as practiced at Tuskegee, is of vast business importance to all of us. The difference between 10 million ignorant blacks and 10 million reasonably educated industrial workers means more than sympathy, more than sentiment, more than our duty. It means wealth to the community. There is no longer the old problem of what to do with the Negro. That question has been settled. The problem now is one of cooperation and help and work. Booker Washington represents the evolution of this problem. His untiring devotion to the cause of the blacks, his modesty, integrity, ability, in short, his greatness in dealing with this question, has brought about such a complete change in the understanding of the problem within the last few years that we can hardly repay the debt. Can we stand by and see a man who has such power to lead and educate his people, begging from door to door for the funds necessary to carry out his work? Is it not our duty to raise such a fund as will enable him to spend most of his time in the South, where he is needed and where he can serve his people and all of us as no other man can do? Now is the time and the opportunity to show our recognition of the wonderful service he has done his people and his country, and to make the opportunity for him to be free to work to the best advantage. He asks an endowment fund of $500,000, a very modest request, now that the white and the Negro of both the North and the South, and the authorities of the state of Alabama, and the President and Congress of the United States have all agreed that Tuskegee and Booker Washington show the true way. We feel confident that there will be a quick response to the appeal to place Tuskegee on a firm financial standing. The Friends of Tuskegee in the past have contributed generously to work out a problem. The problem is now solved, and it should be a privilege to us all to aid in this work, with the full knowledge that every dollar expended by Tuskegee will aid the Negro race in the only effective way, and that our whole country will profit by the investment. At the conclusion of Mr. Baldwin's address, I was introduced to the audience by the presiding officer. In my speech, I told the audience, among other things, that the white people North and South, and the Negroes as well, had practically agreed that the methods of Tuskegee and Hampton offered the best solution of the perplexing Negro problem that had been put forth. In other words, that the whole country had agreed upon this solution of so important an economic, political, and social problem. It was the duty, therefore, of those who could to supply the means for an effective solution in this way. I will not burden the reader with extracts from that speech. After I had concluded, Reverend Dr. W.S. Rainsford, rector of St. George's Church, New York, made a few extemporaneous remarks which were regarded as a strong appeal on behalf of the purpose of the meeting. I only wish I could lay before the reader the remarks of this gentleman in full. He said, among other things, that Tuskegee was doing a work for humanity, not only for the Black Belt, but for the whole country. Pointing to me, he said, "It is our duty to do for that man engaged in that noble work what we failed to do for General Armstrong. We allowed General Armstrong to go around begging from door to door, and carry on the work at Hampton until it killed him. It is our duty to save Mr. Washington from an untimely death brought on in this way. It is our duty to save him for useful service by endowing Tuskegee." As may be partly gleaned from Mr. Cleveland's letter, the results of this meeting began to be felt immediately. A few days after, the lady in the West, mentioned in Mr. Cleveland's letter, gave notice that she would give us $25,000 on condition that the whole amount sought for was raised. We were very pleasantly surprised to receive her check for the $25,000, she having decided to remove the condition. Counting this $25,000 with the $50,000 given by Mr. Huntington and $10,000 by Mr. John D. Rockefeller, the result of the meeting was $85,000. Mr. Rockefeller's $10,000, however, being given for current expenses. Adding what was received as a result of this meeting to our previous endowment fund, we now have 1901, in the hands of our endowment committee about $290,000, from which the school is receiving interest. This does not, of course, include the value of the unsold 25,000 acres of public land. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22, Part 1 of The Story of My Life and Work. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. The Story of My Life and Work by Booker T. Washington. A Description of the Work of the Tuskegee Institute, Part 1. The reader has doubtless noted that much space has been occupied in this volume in detailing the history of the Tuskegee Institute, and to the casual reader this may have appeared out of place in an autobiography. When it is borne in mind, however, that the whole of my time, thought, and energy for the past 18 years have been devoted to the building up of this institute, it will be conceded that in any autobiography of mine, a history of the Tuskegee Institute is unavoidable and necessary. When the history of Tuskegee Institute, since its founding until now, shall be completely written, you will have also a history of my life for the same space of time. It shall be my purpose in this chapter, therefore, to give some definite idea of the extent to which the Institute has grown, and also to describe with some degree of accuracy the work that is being accomplished there in its various departments: agricultural, mechanical, domestic science, nurse training, musical, Bible training, and academic. As has been said many times before, the school began in 1881 with only the state appropriation of $2,000 per annum, specifically for the payment of teachers' salaries and for no other purpose. The method by which we have succeeded in securing the 2,500 acres of land which the school now owns has heretofore been described. This land is mainly comprised in two tracts. The tract that forms the site of the Institute is composed of 835 acres and is known as the Home Farm. The other large tract, which is about 4 miles southeast of the Institute, composed of 800 acres, is known as Marshall Farm. Upon the Home Farm are located the 52 buildings, counting large and small, which make up the Tuskegee Institute. Of these 52 buildings, Alabama, Davidson, Huntington, Cassidy, and Science Halls, the agricultural, trades, and laundry buildings, Carnegie Library, Rockefeller Hall, Dorothy Hall, and the chapel are built of brick. There are also 2 large frame halls, Porter Hall, which was the first building built of the Tuskegee group, and Phelps Hall, a commodious and well-appointed structure dedicated to the Bible training department. The other buildings are smaller frame buildings and various cottages used for commissary, storerooms, recitation rooms, dormitories, and teachers' residences. There are also the shop and sawmill with engine rooms and dynamo in conjunction. The brickyard, where all the bricks that have been used in building our brick buildings were made, is also situated near the school. Last year alone, the brickyard made 1,500,000 bricks. It is equipped with excellent and improved machinery for brick making and is under the immediate supervision of Mr. William Gregory, a graduate of Tuskegee. The total valuation of the property, including the yards and all buildings, the home, and the Marshall Farms, is placed at $300,000. This does not include the endowment fund. The agricultural department of the school has as its head Professor G.W. Carver, a graduate of the Iowa State University and a man of experience as a scientific farmer and a scientist of no mean acquirements. He has 8 assistants who help in looking after the divisions of dairying, stock raising, horticulture, and truck farming embraced in this department. The state of Alabama appropriates annually the sum of $1,500 for the maintenance of an agricultural experiment station in connection with our agricultural department. Some of the experiments of Professor Carver have attracted much attention, and it is recognized that his conduct of the station is doing much to show what improvements upon the old methods of farming may be wrought by scientific agriculture. The department is well housed in a beautiful brick building containing a well-equipped chemical laboratory erected at a cost of $10,000, adapted to the purposes of agricultural experiment and other apparatus necessary for the dairy and other divisions. It is through the direction of the Agricultural Department that the vast amount of farm and garden products used by the 1,200 people constituting the population of the school when in session is grown. About 135 acres of the home farm are devoted to the raising of vegetables, strawberries, grapes, and other fruits. The Marshall Farm, with 350 acres in cultivation, is utilized for the growing of corn, sugar cane, from which syrup is made, potatoes, grain, hay, and other farm products. Mr. J. N. Calloway is the manager of the Marshall Farm. It is worked by student labor, from 30 to 45 boys being employed on it constantly. There is also a night school upon this farm for the accommodation of students who work there, which is a branch of the main night school at the Institute. At present, the farm night school requires the services of 2 teachers. The Marshall Farm not only produces a large amount of the farm products that are used by the school and its 800 head of livestock, counting horses, mules, cows, oxen, sheep, and hogs, but also furnishes opportunity for students to learn the art and science of farming, at the same time attending night school and making something above expenses to be used when the student enters day school. A large portion of the Marshall Farm, about 400 acres, is utilized as pasture for the dry cows and beef cattle. Everything grown upon the farm is sold to the school at market prices. The expenses of running the farm are also accurately kept. At the end of the year, a balance is struck. Last year, the Marshall Farm came out over $500 a head, including in the expense account the salary of the manager. The mechanical department of the institution is now housed in the well-equipped trades building, recently completed at a cost of $36,000. This is known as the Slater Armstrong Memorial Trades Building. It was dedicated and formally opened on Wednesday, January 10, 1900, and is the largest building on the Tuskegee Institute grounds. It stands between the agricultural building and the new chapel. The shape is that of a double Greek cross, having an open court 85 by 112 feet in the center. When completed, it will measure 283 by 300 feet, the main or central portion being 2 stories high, the wings 1 story. This measurement does not include a room for the sawmill, which is to come at the extreme rear end. Owing to the fact that sufficient money has not yet been obtained, the rear portion of the building, consisting of 7 rooms, has not been completed. It is built entirely of brick and contains 27 rooms. In round numbers, it took 1,000 bricks to construct the building thus far, and every one of these bricks was made by students under the instructor in brickmaking, and laid in the wall by students under the instructor of bricklaying. The plans and specifications of the building were drawn by Mr. R. R. Taylor, formerly in charge of the architectural and mechanical drawing department of the Institute. The general oversight of both the planning and construction was, of course, exercised by Mr. J. H. Washington, Director of Industries. The interior arrangements of the building are well suited to the teaching of the trades. The rooms, while varying in size from 37 by 42, the smallest, to 37 by 85, the largest, will average 37 by 55, the ceiling being 13 feet high. On the first floor there are the director's office, reading room, exhibit room, wheelwright's shop, blacksmith shop, tin shop, printing office, carpenter shop, repair shop, woodworking machine room, ironworking machine room, foundry, brickmaking, and plastering rooms, general stock and supply room, and a boiler and engine room. The second floor contains the mechanical drawing room, harness shop, paint shop, tailor shop, shoe shop, and electrical laboratory, and a room for carriage trimming and upholstering. Each shop has a cloak and tool room connected with it. Better lighted rooms could scarcely be found in any building. Each shop receives light from two sides and end. The office, reading room, and exhibit room are finished with wainscoting to window sills and plastered from there up and overhead. In the drawing rooms the walls are plastered, but overhead the ceiling of this room is of yellow pine paneled so as to show design. The ceiling is painted white. The other rooms are not plastered or sealed, but have what is called a yellow ochre finish on the walls. The machinery in the building is run by a 125 horsepower engine and 75 horsepower boiler, both donated by Mr. C.P. Huntington of New York. Each division is well supplied with all of the tools, appliances, and machinery necessary to its successful working and to the accurate teaching of the trades. The director of this large and important department is Mr. J. H. Washington, who has under him 22 instructors for the various divisions. We believe it is wise to give our girls the most thorough training in all those occupations suitable and adapted to women, without in the least neglecting those moral and intellectual powers which elevate any race. With this in view, we have the following departments for the training of our young women. The Department for the Teaching of the Domestic Sciences has for its directress Mrs. Booker T. Washington. This department embraces laundering, cooking, dressmaking, plain sewing, millinery, mattress making, horticulture, gardening, and poultry raising. It is in Dorothy Hall. Not only are the trades above named taught in this department, but the young women, under the motherly direction of Mrs. Booker T. Washington, are taught the duties of systematic and orderly housekeeping and duties pertaining thereto. The nurse training department is conducted in connection with the school hospital and has for its instructors our resident physician and a competent trained nurse. It has not been constituted a separate department, but has formed one of the divisions under the director of the mechanical department. The increasing demand for trained nurses in the South has necessitated the establishment of a regular training school for nurses in connection with the school hospital. A complete course of 3 years has been laid out, 2 years of which consist of daily work and instruction in the hospital, and the 3rd year of lectures and bedside instructions, while 1 or 2 days of each week are devoted to hospital work. There are special provisions for those who apply for this department only. The school is open also to those who do not wish to follow the work as a profession, but desire to know how to intelligently care for the sick. The Division of Music is under the supervision of the director of the academic department, and like the nurse training department, it has not been constituted an independent department. While the study of music has always been encouraged at Tuskegee and considerable work has been done, we have been able only within the last few years to furnish a systematic and thorough course of study. The course in pianoforte embraces 4 years. The institution owns 8 pianos, 2 cabinet organs, and a library of music. Vocal music is taught to the classes in the academic department throughout the entire course. Tuskegee students are famous for their fine singing of plantation melodies, and it is the object of the Institute to make these old, sweet slave songs a source of pride and pleasure to the students. There are at Tuskegee the following musical organizations: a choir consisting of 75 voices, a choral society consisting of 150 voices, organized for the study of music from the masters, glee club consisting of 40 male voices, glee club consisting of 20 female voices, and a male quartet whose work is to travel in the North. The institution maintains an excellent brass band of 30 pieces, which is instructed by a competent director employed by the school. Any student possessing knowledge of wind instruments will be given a chance to enter the band, but this knowledge is not essential to membership. The band plays every school day morning for inspection and drill. One of the most important branches of the music department is the orchestra, which consists of 14 pieces. The same rule regarding membership in the band holds good for the orchestra. The orchestra plays every weeknight at evening devotions. Many students who have played in the orchestra have developed into competent musicians. The director of the band has charge of the orchestra. All students belonging to the orchestra are subject to certain rules governing this organization. End of chapter 22, part 1. Chapter 22, part 2 of The Story of My Life and Work. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. The Story of My Life and Work by Booker T. Washington. Chapter 22. A Description of the Work of the Tuskegee Institute. Part 2. The Bible Training Department was established in 1893. The desire for increased opportunities for those who wish to fit themselves for the ministry or other forms of Christian work in the South had been long felt. To meet this need, a generous lady in New York erected at Tuskegee a building called Phelps Hall, a picture of which is herewith given, containing a chapel, library, reading room, office, 3 recitation rooms, and 40 sleeping rooms, to be used as a Bible school. The donor of this building furnished each room in a comfortable and convenient manner, making it one of the most beautiful and desirable buildings on the school grounds. The instruction is wholly undenominational. It is the aim of this new department to help all denominations and not to antagonize any. The Bible school is not in opposition to any other theological work now being done, but it is simply a means of helping. The faculty is composed of some of the strongest men in the country. Reverend Edgar J. Penny is in charge of the work, assisted by Reverend B. H. Peterson, Right Reverend B. T. Tanner, Reverend C. O. Booth, D.D., and Right Reverend George W. Clinton have been engaged to give a regular course of lectures during each term. The members of the Bible School are required to do mission work on the Sabbath in the neighboring churches, preaching and teaching in the Sunday schools whenever their services are needed, and to make weekly reports in writing of the work done. It is not necessary to have a special call to the ministry to enter the Bible School at Tuskegee. Many who desire to do only missionary work or to become intelligent teachers of the Bible in the study of Sunday schools will be greatly benefited and helped. Indeed, quite a few of those who are now members of this department are fitting themselves for this kind of work. The demand for an educated ministry is growing throughout the South, and those who expect to preach must prepare themselves for the work. This department was established for the express purpose of giving colored men and women a knowledge of the English Bible, implanting in their hearts a noble ambition to go out into the dark and benighted districts of the South and give their lives for the elevation and Christianizing of the South. Last year, 83 students attended this department. This was the largest attendance since the department was founded. Last, but not least, I mention the academic department, which offers a thorough course of instruction, nearly, if not quite, equal to the high school courses of the northern and western states. No language, however, except English, is taught. It is our aim to correlate the work of the academic department with the industrial departments, and it is the policy of the school not to give any student a diploma of graduation who has not completed the course in at least one division of one or another of the industrial departments. Last year, of the 1,164 students who attended the Institute, except a part of those in the Bible Training School, all were taking studies in this department, either in the night or day school, they being about equally divided between the night and the day school. The night school course is so arranged that a student is enabled to do just half the amount of work in night school as in day school. A student in night school will therefore cover a year's work as laid out for day school students in 2 years. In 1899, there were 71 graduates from all of the departments. We received $20,000 from Mr. Andrew Carnegie for a new library building. Our first library and reading room were in a corner of a shanty, occupying a space of about 5 by 12 feet. It was 10 years from my first effort before I was able to secure Mr. Carnegie's interest and help. The first time I saw him, 10 years before, he seemed to take but little interest in our school, but I was determined to show him that we were worthy of his help. The following letter will explain itself. December 15th, 1900. Mr. Andrew Carnegie, 5 West 51st Street, New York. Dear Sir, complying with the request which you made of me when I saw you at your residence a few days ago, I now submit in writing an appeal for a library building for our institution. We have 1,100 students, 86 officers and instructors, together with their families, and about 200 colored people living near the school, all of whom would make use of the library building. We have over 12,000 books, periodicals, etc., gifts from our friends, but we have no suitable place for them, and we have no suitable reading room. Our graduates go to work in every section of the South, and whatever knowledge might be obtained in the library would serve to assist in the elevation of the Negro race. Such a building as we need could be erected for about $20,000. All of the work for the building, such as brick making, brick masonry, carpentry, blacksmithing, etc., would be done by the students. The money which you would give would not only supply the building, but the erection of the building would give a large number of students an opportunity to learn the building trades, and the students would use the money paid to them to keep themselves in school. I do not believe that a similar amount of money often could be made to go so far in uplifting a whole race. If you wish further information, I shall be glad to furnish it. Yours truly, Booker T. Washington, Principal. The next mail brought the following reply. I will be very glad to pay the bills for the library building as they are incurred, to the extent of $20,000, and I am glad of the opportunity to show the interest I have in your noble work. As illustrating the value of the work which we are doing at Tuskegee, I am glad to add that I was agreeably surprised during the summer of 1900 to receive a letter from the German consul at Washington, asking me to meet him for a conference. In the conference it developed that his government had heard of the value of the agricultural work being done at Tuskegee, and that he was commissioned by the Committee of Agriculture of the German government to secure 4 persons from Tuskegee to go to Africa to introduce cotton raising into the German colony of Togo. After considering the matter in all its details, Messrs. John W. Robinson, Allen L. Burks, Shepard L. Harris, as graduates of the institution were selected, and with them Mr. J. N. Callaway, who for a number of years had been in charge of one of the school farms, went to serve as superintendent and executive manager of the enterprise. This experiment is being watched with the greatest interest throughout this country. Germany has an African dominion amounting to 925,000 square miles, which is a third larger than the total area of the American cotton-producing states. It has been found that this territory is fertile, fairly well watered, and not too hot for cotton. Togo, in which the experiment is being tried, is north of the Gulf of Guinea and 400 miles north of the equator. It is a little larger than South Carolina and has an estimated Negro population of 2½ millions. The party sailed from New York November 3, 1900, carrying with them plows, hoes, cotton gin and press, ties, and several varieties of cottonseed. The German government has enjoined secrecy upon those interested in the experiment, and so no detailed information can be published aside from the fact that the experiment is succeeding admirably. Messrs. Robinson and Burks are graduates of the academic and agricultural departments of the school. Mr. Harris is a graduate of the academic and mechanical departments. The latter has charge of the matter of building gin houses and such other structures as may be needed. It is true that the action is experimental, but those engaged in it are most hopeful. The young men, under the careful guidance of Mr. Callaway, are perhaps the pioneers in a movement which may mean much in the economic history of the world. The German government, in committing this experiment to the hands of graduates of Tuskegee, has shown a breadth of view which is appreciated. If any people can make a success in cotton raising in West Africa, we believe that the graduates sent out from Tuskegee will do it. I cannot close this chapter without making some special reference to the chapel at Tuskegee, since this is regarded as the architectural gem of the Tuskegee group of buildings. It was planned by Mr. R. Taylor, who was then our teacher in architecture and mechanical drawing. The work of construction, even to the making of the bricks, was done wholly by students. The cost of erection of the building was valued at $30,000. The following is a description of the building, a cut of which is also given in this volume. The plan of the chapel is that of a Greek cross, the main axis extending from northeast to southwest. The extreme dimension from northeast to southwest, extending through nave and choir, is 154 feet 6 inches. The dimension from northwest to southeast through transepts is 106 feet. The roof is of the hammer beam construction. The clear span of the main trusses is 63 feet, which is the width of the nave and transept. The angle trusses have a clear span of 87 feet, projections from the walls under trusses slightly decreasing the span. The gallery on back is 30 feet wide, extending over girls' cloakroom and 12 feet into main auditorium. In the rear are choir room, study for minister, and 2 small vestibules, one on either side of chapel, giving entrance to choir room, study, and main auditorium. A large basement is provided, and in this the steam heating plant is located. At the northeast end of the auditorium is the pulpit platform, which is large enough to seat the entire faculty of 88 members. This platform is 2 feet 6 inches above the main floor. Immediately behind this, and elevated 3 feet above it, is the choir stand, with seating capacity for 150 persons. The chapel is sufficiently supplied with windows to give abundant light and ventilation, a very pretty effect being secured by the use of delicately tinted colored glass. The woodwork is all of yellow pine with hard oil finish, except the floor, which is of oak. The seating capacity of the auditorium is 2,400. 1,200,000 bricks were used in the construction, all made and laid by students. All the moldings, casings, and caps used were made by students. The floor is bowled. The height of the walls from top of floor is 24 feet 6 inches. From floor line to highest point of ceiling, 48 feet 6 inches. The height of tower from line of ground to top of cross, which terminates it, 105 feet. The electric lighting is from 3 main chandeliers with 30 lights each, 10 of 2 lights each, 12 of 1 light each, and from a reflecting disc of 40 lights over the choir stand. Gradually, by patience and hard work, we have brought order out of chaos, just as will be true of any problem if we stick to it with patience and wisdom and earnest effort. As I look back now over our struggle, I am glad that we had it. I am glad that we endured all those discomforts and inconveniences. I am glad that our students had to dig out the place for their kitchen and dining room. I am glad that our first boarding place was in that dismal, ill-lighted, and damp basement. Had we started in a fine, attractive, convenient room, I fear we would have lost our heads and become stuck up. It means a great deal, I think, to build on a foundation which one has made for himself. When our students return to Tuskegee now, as they often do, and go into our large, beautiful, well-ventilated, and well-lighted dining room, and see tempting, well-cooked food, largely grown by the students themselves, and see tables, neat tablecloths and napkins, and vases of flowers upon the tables, and hear singing birds, and note that each meal is served exactly upon the minute, with no disorder and with almost no complaint coming from the hundreds that now fill our dining room, they too often say to me that they are glad that we started as we did, and built ourselves up year by year by a slow and natural process of growth. The school is regularly incorporated under the name of the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute. The charter was granted by special act of the legislature of Alabama. It provides for a board of 19 trustees. As now constituted, October 1901, their names are George W. Campbell, President, Tuskegee, Alabama. Reverend G. L. Cheney, Vice President, Leominster, Massachusetts. Reverend R. C. Bedford, Secretary, Beloit, Wisconsin. Warren Logan, Treasurer, Tuskegee, Alabama. Lewis Adams, Tuskegee, Alabama. Charles W. Hare, Tuskegee, Alabama. Booker T. Washington, Tuskegee, Alabama. George Foster Peabody, New York. Robert C. Ogden, New York. John C. Grant, LL.D., Chicago, Illinois. J. W. Adams, Montgomery, Alabama. Reverend George A. Gordon, D.D., Boston, Massachusetts. Reverend Charles F. Dole, Boston, Massachusetts. J. G. Phelps Stokes, New York. S. C. Dizer, Boston, Massachusetts. William H. Baldwin, Jr., New York. R. O. Simpson, Furman, Alabama. Hugh H. Hanna, Indianapolis, Indiana. Mr. Campbell has been president of the board from the beginning and in the 20 years of its history has never missed a meeting. End of chapter 22, part 2.
Chapter 23, Part 1 of the Story of My Life and Work. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Kennedy. The Story of My Life and Work by Booker T. Washington. Looking Backward, Part 1. My work at Tuskegee has always been of a threefold nature. First, the executive work of the institution proper. Second, the securing of money with which to carry on the institution. And third, the education through the public press and through public addresses of the white people North and South as to the condition and needs of the race. On the grounds, in addition to the ordinary task involved in educating and disciplining over 1,000 students, is added the responsibility of training them in parental directions, involving systematic regulations for bathing, eating, sleeping, the use of the toothbrush, and care of health. In performing these duties, especially in collecting money in the early years, I have often met with many discouragements. But I early resolved to let nothing cause me to despair completely. The first time I went north to secure money for the Tuskegee Institute, I remember that on my way I called to see one of the secretaries of an organization which for years had been deeply interested in the education of our people in the South. I supposed, of course, that I should receive a most cordial and encouraging reception at his hands. To my surprise, he received me most coldly, and proceeded to tell me in the most discouraging tones possible that I had made a mistake by coming north to secure aid for our school, and he advised me to take the first train south. He said that I could not possibly succeed in securing any funds for Tuskegee. In fact, he told me very frankly that I would not secure enough money to pay my traveling expenses. I confess that this bucket of cold water thrown upon me at a time when I needed encouraging and sympathetic words more than anything else rather tended to take the heart out of me, but I determined not to give up, but to keep pressing forward until I had thoroughly demonstrated whether or not it was possible for me to secure funds in the North. I will not prolong this story except to say that within a period of 4 years after I was so coldly received by this secretary, he introduced me where I was to speak at a large public meeting in New York City in the interest of Tuskegee, and in introducing me to the large audience, he used the most flattering language and praised me without stint for the successful work that I was engaged in doing. I do not know whether he remembered, while he was introducing me, that I was a young man he had discouraged only 4 years before. I shall never forget my first experience in speaking before a Northern audience. Before I went north, General Armstrong had talked to me a good deal about what to say and how to say it. I shall always remember one of his injunctions, which was, give them an idea for every word. When I first went into the North to get money, I began work in 1 or 2 of the small towns in the western part of Massachusetts. As I remember it, the first town that I reached was Northampton. As I expected to remain in the town several days, my first effort was to find a colored family with whom I could board. But as very few colored families lived in that town, I found this not an easy job. It did not occur to me that I could find accommodation at any of the hotels in Northampton. As an indication of General Armstrong's deep interest and helpful influence in the establishment and progress of this institution, I insert a letter of recommendation he gave me to be used among people in the North. These letters were always given most freely, and the General was constantly in search of opportunities to serve the school. Hampton, Virginia, October 26, 1891. This is to introduce Mr. Booker T. Washington, the head of the Tuskegee, Alabama Colored Normal and Industrial School. It is a noble, notable work, the best product of Negro enterprise of the century. I make this statement advisedly. I beg a hearing for Mr. Washington. He is a true Moses. As much as any man in the land, he is securing to the whole country the moral results which the Civil War meant to produce. Tuskegee is a bright spot in the black belt of the South. It is a proof that the Negro can raise the Negro. S. C. Armstrong. On the day before General Armstrong was stricken with the paralysis which finally resulted in his death, I remember that I met him on Beacon Street in Boston and told him that some ladies in New York were discussing the matter of giving us a new building, but seemed somewhat undecided as to the wisdom of doing so. I was talking to the General about interceding in order to get these friends to decide to furnish the building. He seemed greatly interested in the matter and promised to either see or communicate with these New York ladies. Before we finished our conversation, however, we were interrupted by someone and we did not finish the talk about the building. The next day, General Armstrong was stricken with paralysis, and no one was permitted to see him for several days. After several days had passed by, the doctors seemed to be convinced that he could not live but for a few hours, and I, in company with several other persons, was allowed to see him in his room at the Parker House. To my surprise, the minute I entered the room, he took up the thread of our conversation concerning the building where it was broken off several days previously on Beacon Street, and began at once advising how to secure the building. The General did not recover from this stroke of paralysis, but lived about 8 months after it. In January 1893, that is, about 4 months before he died, he came to Tuskegee, or rather was brought to Tuskegee, because he was too weak to travel alone, and remained a guest at my house for 3 weeks. During these weeks he suffered intensely at times, but was always in good spirits and cheerful. His heart was so wrapped up in the elevation of the Negro that it seemed impossible to induce him to take any rest. Most of the time when he was not asleep, he was planning or advising concerning the interest of the black man, and spent much time in writing articles for newspapers and to friends in the North. He was present during the session of our Negro Conference in February 1893, and it was a memorable sight to see him carried by the strong arms of 4 students up the stairs of the chapel and into the presence of the conference. The impression that the sight of General Armstrong made upon the members of the conference is almost indescribable. All felt as though he was their most strong and helpful friend, and they had a confidence in him that they had in no other being on earth. It was at this conference that General Armstrong made his first attempt to speak in public after he was stricken with paralysis, and his success in being heard and understood was so encouraging that he spoke to audiences on several other occasions. I must not neglect to mention the manner in which General Armstrong and Mr. Howe, the farm manager at Hampton, were received at the school on the occasion of this visit, for this was the second visit that the general had made to the school. Both students and teachers were most anxious to do him all the honor possible, and for several weeks previous to his coming, we were quite busily engaged in devising some plan to receive the general in a proper manner. At last, it was decided to ask the authorities of the Tuskegee Railroad to run a special train from Tuskegee to Chehaw to meet the general. This request the railroad authorities very kindly granted. He arrived upon the school grounds at about 9 o'clock at night. Each student and teacher had supplied themselves with a long piece of light wood, or litted, as the colored people are in the habit of calling it. A long line was formed, and when he came upon the school grounds, the general was driven between two rows of students, each one holding one of these lighted torches. The effect was most interesting and gratifying. I think I never saw anything done for the general which seemed to make him so happy and give him such satisfaction as this reception. The first public address that I delivered in the North was in Chicopee, a town not far from Springfield. I spoke in the Congregational Church in the morning, but was careful to commit my entire address to memory. I was a little embarrassed after the morning meeting was over, when several of the members of the congregation, in congratulating me over my success, stated that they had enjoyed my morning address so much that they had planned to go to Chicopee Falls, an adjoining town, to hear me speak in the evening. As I had only the one address to deliver, one can easily see that I was in rather an embarrassing position. While the greater portion of my speaking has been before Northern white audiences, I also improve every opportunity to speak to my own people, both in the North and in the South. In fact, during the earlier years of the institution, I carried on a regular campaign of speaking among the colored people in the South, going to their churches, Sunday schools, associations, institutes, camp meetings, conferences, etc. They did not, as I have stated, take kindly to the idea of industrial education at first, and it was largely by reason of my effort in these public meetings that I succeeded in converting them to the idea of favoring it. At one time I hired a team and took one of the older students with me, and we drove for many miles, stopping at the homes of individuals and at churches to explain to them the work of the school. The first opportunity I had to speak to a Southern white audience was on the occasion of the gathering of the Christian Workers' Convention, which was held in Atlanta in 1893. It seems that it was largely because of the impression that I made upon this audience in Atlanta that the authorities of the Atlanta Exposition were led to extend me an invitation to deliver an address at the opening of that exposition. I shall let an account given in the Christian World, published in New Haven, Connecticut, take the place of my own words in regard to this address before the Christian Workers' Convention. Booker T. Washington, principal of the Tuskegee, Alabama Normal and Industrial Institute, was given a place on the program at the Convention of Christian Workers held at Atlanta, Georgia in 1893, for a few minutes' report of progress, the time being thus brief on account of the fact that a full report with questions and answers covering 3/4 of an hour had been given at the convention the year previous, held in Tremont Temple, Boston. When he made the engagement, he doubtless expected to be either at Tuskegee, which is not far from Atlanta, or spending the convention days with other Christian workers in Atlanta. It came about, however, that he found it necessary to make engagements in the North immediately before and after the date on which he was announced to speak at Atlanta. To keep his Atlanta engagement, it was necessary that he should leave Boston for that city, reaching there on the last train arriving before he was announced to speak, and to return north on the first train leaving Atlanta after his brief address. It was a great sacrifice for a 5 minutes address. Mr. Washington said simply that it was his duty to keep his appointment. It does not appear that the fact that he would be compelled to travel about 500 miles for every minute of his address had much weight or even consideration. To do his duty was not small or unimportant. The results of this address were great beyond all human thought. Mr. Washington has since stated that he had never before made an address to the white people of the South. His audience of over 2,000 leading Christian people, ministers, businessmen, legislators, lawmakers, judges, officials, representatives of the press from Atlanta, from Georgia, and from other states of the South were charmed by his personality and the passionate earnestness with which he set forth the magnificent scheme of Christian effort at Tuskegee and pleaded for the upbuilding of his race under Southern skies. This representative audience saw before them a representative of his race such as they had not been wont to see. His address was flashed over the wires by sympathetic press agents through the South, and he probably never before spoke to a larger and more influential audience. But in the providence of God, there was still greater results. I have always made it a rule to keep engagements of a public nature when I have once made a promise to do so. On one occasion, I had an appointment to speak in a small country church not far from Boston. Just before night, a severe snowstorm came up, and although I knew this storm would keep everyone from the meeting, I made it a point to be present. When I got to the church, there was no one present except the sexton. The minister himself did not come, and when I saw him later, he was surprised to find that I had been at the church on the night appointed, and told me he felt sure I would not be present on account of the storm. In the earlier days of the institution, of course, it was a difficult task to secure interviews with persons of prominence and wealth in the North, but General Armstrong's recommendations, which he was always willing to give, in most cases served to secure me a hearing. It was equally difficult in our early history to secure opportunities from ministers and others to speak before their congregations. Such calls on ministers were, of course, very numerous, and one can hardly blame them for shutting out those with whom they were not well acquainted. I have often been surprised to note the number of irresponsible and unworthy colored men and women who spend their time in the North attempting to secure money for institutions that in many cases have no existence, or when they exist at all, are in such a feeble and unorganized condition as in no way to have a claim upon the generosity of the public. Many of these schools, of course, within a radius of a mile or two, do reasonably good work, but I am quite sure that time has come when the North should confine its gifts wholly to the larger and well-organized institutions, which are able to train teachers or industrial leaders who will go out and show these local communities how to build up schools for themselves. $300 or $400 given to one local community may serve to help it for a time, but there are 100,000 other communities that need help just as much. Scattering a few $100s here and there among local communities amounts to little in putting the people upon their feet, but putting it into a teacher who will show the community how to help itself means much in the way of the solution of our problem. End of Chapter 23, Part 1. Chapter 23, Part 2 of the story of my life and work. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Kennedy. The Story of My Life and Work by Booker T. Washington. Looking Backward, Part 2. The constant work of appealing to individuals, speaking before churches, Sunday schools, etc., gradually served to make the institution known in most parts of the country. This was true to such an extent that in 1883 we received our first legacy of $500 through the will of Mr. Frederick Marquand of Southport, Connecticut. This was a most pleasant and gratifying surprise to us, as we had no thought of anyone's remembering us in this way. Since then, however, hardly a year has passed that we have not been remembered by a legacy. The largest sum that we have received in this manner has been $30,000 through the will of Mr. Edward Austin of Boston. Mr. Austin's case is another one which shows, as I have already mentioned, that one should try to cultivate the habit of doing his duty to the full extent each day and not worry over results. I remember that the first time I saw Mr. Austin was about the year 1885, when the late Dr. W.I. Bowditch of Boston gave me a letter to him. At that time, Mr. Austin gave me his check for $50, but gave nothing between 1885 and 1896, and seemed to take little interest in the school. In fact, I had supposed that he had forgotten all about us. I tried on several occasions to get another audience with him, but did not succeed. In 1896, while in Boston, I was very much surprised to receive an invitation from Mr. Austin to call at his home. He was then very feeble, being over 90 years of age, but he told me that he had remembered us in his will, and that as it would not be possible for him to live much longer, we would likely come into possession of the money within a reasonably short time, which proved to be true. On another occasion, I walked a long distance out into the country during a cold winter day to see a gentleman who lived near Stamford, Connecticut. More than once, I was rather inclined to blame myself for exposing my body to the cold on what might prove a fruitless journey. When I arrived at the gentleman's house rather late in the evening, he gave me, after considerable hesitation, a small check, but did not seem to take a great deal of interest in the school. The following year, however, I succeeded in obtaining from him a check for a somewhat larger amount. His interest, however, continued to grow from year to year, so that in 1891 he surprised us all by sending a check for $10,000. Up to that time, this was the largest single gift in cash that the institution had ever received, and my readers can well imagine that the receipt of this large sum caused a day of general rejoicing on the grounds of Tuskegee. I have referred already to the gift of $400 from a friend who helped us when we were in an embarrassing position. I might add that the following year, this same friend sent us a check for $3,000, and since that time she and her sister have given regularly to us $3,000 each year. These two friends have done as much, if not more, to keep the institution on a firm footing than anyone else that I know of. I have had, in my 18 years of experience in collecting money for the Tuskegee Institute, some very interesting episodes. On the whole, collecting money is hard, disagreeable, wearing work, but there are some compensations that come from it. In the first place, it brings one into contact with some of the best people in the world, as well as some of the meanest and most narrow ones. Very often, when I have been in the North seeking money, I have found myself completely without cash. I remember one time while in Providence, Rhode Island, that when I had spent all the money I had and was still without breakfast, when, in crossing the streets, I found 25 cents near the sidewalk. With this, I bought my breakfast, and with the added strength and courage which the breakfast gave me, I went in quest of donations for Tuskegee, and was soon rewarded by several large gifts. As an example of the way in which I have used my time from year to year, there have been many occasions when I have slept in 3 different beds in one night while traveling through different portions of the country. I give here a portion of a schedule which I followed on a recent lecture tour in the West. This will enable my readers to judge whether or not to speak from night to night is the easy job that many people take it to be. I spoke at Mount Vernon, Iowa, January 19, 1900, 8 p.m., then took the 11 o'clock train for Cedar Rapids, where I arrived in about 25 minutes. Laid over in Cedar Rapids until 3:15 o'clock a.m., then took the Burlington, Cedar Rapids, and Northern Railway for Columbus Junction, where I arrived about 5 o'clock in the morning, remaining in Columbus Junction until about 8 o'clock, when I took the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railway for Centerville, Iowa, where I arrived at 12:37, January 20th, much fatigued and worn out from the long journey over 3 different railroads. At 8 o'clock, I again spoke, and at 12:18 a.m. again took the train for Chicago, which I was billed to speak twice the same day. And on the following morning, I took the train for a long journey westward, finally ending in Denver, and in returning stopped off at Omaha and other places. During 1892, I was asked by Reverend Lyman Abbott, D.D., editor of The Outlook, to write an article for his paper which would let the country know the exact condition and needs of the Negro ministry in the South. In this article, I told as fully and frankly as I could just what the condition of the ministry was mentally, morally, and religiously. A very large proportion of the colored ministers throughout the country became greatly incensed at what I said, feeling that I had injured the Negro ministry very materially by my plain language. For almost a year after this article was written, scarcely a Negro conference or association assembled in any part of the country that did not proceed to pass resolutions condemning me and the article which I had written. This went on for some time, but I was determined not to in any way yield the position which I had taken, for the reason that I knew that I was right and had spoken the truth. At the time when the discussion and condemnation of myself were at the highest pitch, the late Bishop D.A. Payne of the AME Church wrote a letter endorsing all the statements which I had made, and adding on his own account that I had not told the whole truth. This, of course, added fresh fuel to the flames, and the bishop for several months came in for his share of condemnation. At the present time, after the lapse of 8 years, I feel that the institution at Tuskegee and myself personally have no warmer friends than we have in the Negro ministers. Almost without exception, at the present time they acknowledge that the article which I wrote has done the whole body of ministers a great deal of good, that bishops and other church officers were made to realize the importance of not only purifying the ministry as far as possible, but demanding a higher standard in the pulpit, so far as mental education was concerned. I scarcely ever go anywhere without receiving the thanks of ministers for my plain talk. They feel that they are greatly indebted to me for much of the improvement that has taken place within recent years. Of course, when it is considered that at the time I wrote this article, a very small proportion of the colored ministers had had an opportunity to secure systematic training that would give them mental strength and moral and religious stamina, it could not have been expected that any large proportion would have been fitted in the highest degree for the office of ministers. The improvement at the present time is constantly going on, and within a few years I believe that the Negro Church is going to be quite a different thing from what it had the reputation of being in the past. At all times, during the discussion and condemnation of myself, there were not wanting strong and prominent persons in different parts of the country among our own race who stood valiantly and bravely by the position which I had taken. Among them, as leader, was Mr. T. Thomas Fortune, the editor of the New York Age. Mr. Fortune, in this matter, as in all other matters where he has considered my position the correct one, has defended and supported me without regard to his personal popularity or unpopularity. While he and I differ and have differed on many important public questions, we have never allowed our differences to mar our personal friendship. In all matters pertaining to the welfare of our race in the South, I have always consulted him most freely and frankly. For example, in the preparation of the open letter to the Louisiana State Constitutional Convention, Mr. Fortune and myself sat up nearly one whole night at Tuskegee preparing this letter. I have seldom ever given any public utterances to the country that have not had his criticism and approval. His help and friendship to me in many directions have been most potent in enabling me to accomplish whatever I have been able to do. In the same class with Mr. Fortune, I would put my private secretary, Mr. Emmett J. Scott, who, for a number of years, has been in the closest and most helpful relations to me in all my work. Without his constant and painstaking care, it would be impossible for me to perform even a very small part of the labor that I now do. Mr. Scott understands so thoroughly my motives, plans, and ambitions that he puts himself into my own position as nearly as it is possible for one individual to put himself into the place of another, and in this way makes himself invaluable not only to me personally, but to the institution. Such a man as Mr. Scott I have found exceedingly rare. Only once or twice in a lifetime are such people discovered. There is only one way for an individual to collect money for a worthy institution, as there is only one way for him to succeed in any line of work, and that is to make up his mind to do his duty to the fullest extent and let results take care of themselves. In the earlier year of the institution, I called to see a rich gentleman in New York who did not even ask me to take a seat, but in a gruff and cold manner handed me $2, as if to say, "I give you this to get rid of you." Since that time, this same individual has given to Tuskegee as much as $10,000 in cash at one time. In other cases, where I found it impossible to secure an audience, in the early days of this work, I have since been sent for by these same individuals and asked to accept money for the institution. In many cases, I have gone to individuals and presented our cause only to receive an insult or the coldest and most discouraging reception. Perhaps the next individual on whom I called would politely and earnestly thank me for calling and giving him an opportunity to make a gift to Tuskegee. During the early struggles of our work, in many instances I went to ministers in the North to secure opportunities to speak in their churches, but received no for my answer. Often, where I have received such answers, I have since received letters from these same ministers urging that I would deliver lectures in their churches, and naming large sums of money as compensation for my lectures. The institution has now reached a point where it conducts all of its affairs on a more strictly cash basis than in its earlier years. In fact, the general policy of the school at present is to undertake no enterprise in the way of improvements until it has the money in hand for such improvements. This policy could not be carried out very well in the early years of the school, when we were so hard pressed for buildings. One thing which I have always thought has helped us a great deal is that we have always made it a point to have the strictest and most approved system of bookkeeping in connection with all of our financial transactions. Our books have been at all times open to the inspection of the public. In accounting for our income and expenditures, Mr. Logan, our treasurer, from the first has been of the highest service to the institution. We have never allowed any carelessness in the matter of bookkeeping. I have often been asked by young men how they can succeed in this or that direction. My advice to them is to make up their minds carefully, in the first place, as to what they want to do, and then persistently devote themselves to accomplishing that end, letting nothing discourage them. If I may be allowed a little pardonable pride in connection with this statement, I would add, to show how mistaken that secretary was who attempted to discourage me by telling me that I would not secure enough funds to pay my traveling expenses, that since the institution at Tuskegee was started, I have collected myself, or been instrumental in causing others to help me secure, all told, fully $1 million for the permanent plant, endowment, and the annual expenses of Tuskegee. Were I to attempt to give an account of all the ways and means by which individuals have tried to discourage me since I began at Tuskegee, this little book would contain little else than that. I have always found it easy to find people who could tell me how a thing could not be accomplished, but very hard to find those who could tell me how a thing could be accomplished. In my opinion, the world is much more interested in finding people who know how to accomplish something than those who merely explain why it is impossible to accomplish certain results. I have been asked many times how I have succeeded in this thing or in that thing. In almost every case I replied that it has required constant, hard, conscientious work. I consider that there is no permanent success possible without hard and severe effort, coupled with the highest and most praiseworthy aims. Luck, as I have experienced it, is only another name for hard work. Almost any individual can succeed in any legitimate enterprise that he sets his heart upon, if he is willing to pay the price. But the price, in most cases, is being willing to toil when others are resting, being willing to work while others are sleeping, being willing to put forth the severest effort when there is no one to see or applaud. It is comparatively easy to find people who are willing to work when the world is looking on and ready to give applause, but very hard to find those who are willing to work in the corner or at midnight when there is no watchful eye or anyone to give applause. I end this volume as I began, with an apology for writing it. It is always highly distasteful to me to speak about myself, and in writing what I have attempted, in a small degree at least, to subordinate my own personal feelings with a view to giving the public as much information as possible. I hope that some permanent good will result from my effort. End of chapter 23. End of the story of my life and work by Booker T. Washington.